Please be seated. Our faith is full of paradoxes. And I don't know about you, but for me, they're often confusing, frustrating, and sometimes they make you just want to give up. Let me give you an example. Last week, somebody came to my office and they said, somebody told me that our faith, because we're a Trinitarian faith, is just a polytheistic faith. We just have gods, not just one God. We don't believe in one God. What do you say to them? Well, this isn't going to be a sermon about the Trinity because that could take all day long. Suffice it to say that our faith is in one God, but the God is a little more complicated than most of us want. On the other hand, so is our faith. Our faith is a little more complicated than we want it to be, isn't it? Even despite what Paul says in the epistle, our faith is a little more complicated. Now, if you read Paul one way, you'll sit there and you think what faith is you say, I believe, and that's it. That's all that is really necessary. All I got to do is believe. But even Paul wasn't exactly saying just that. He was arguing against people who said, all you got to do is do good things and you'll earn your ticket to heaven. But even the example that Paul uses is more complicated than that. Paul uses Abram, who we would later know as Abraham, but he was still Abram at the point. And he says, when Abram believed God, it was reckoned to him as righteousness. But you can't leave the story there, can you? Because if all Abram had done was said, I believe you're God, yay, nothing would have happened. What happens after that? Where does Abram leave it? He doesn't just leave it there. He can't just leave it there. He goes somewhere. His faith is that he trusts the one who has sent him to take him to a place he has never been before. He trusts this God who has called him to take him away from his family, away from his land. You've got to have the faith, but it has to be trust enough to be led. Faith is the same as trust is the same as saying faith, and the same thing as saying belief. Those three things belong together. And they also belong in action. The trust and the movement belong together. They're part of one equation. One does not work without the other. Think about Nicodemus when he went to Jesus. Right? And Jesus says this peculiar thing that Nicodemus cannot grasp. Jesus says, well, unless you're born from above, and some translations do say unless you're born again, but the closest to the Greek is, or to the Aramaic is, unless you're born from above, then you can't have any part of this. And Nicodemus doesn't get it. But think about what he's saying. Without being born of the Spirit, we are dead. But without the flesh, without being born in the flesh, we cannot do anything that God would have us do here. Both are parts of an equation. You have to have one and one to equal two. They're both necessary. The Spirit and the flesh. The belief and the action. Last week I was talking about how a lot of people of faith had to first consider the consequences of their actions. And there are sometimes dire consequences. You know, those who hid the runaway slaves on the Underground Railroad, or those in Germany and Europe who hid Jews from the Nazis. In fact, on Friday, just day before yesterday, I was meeting with somebody when we were talking about that, and they said, yeah, my grandfather was shot by the Nazis for hiding Jews. You never know how close that is. So there are those consequences for the actions. But the point of it is that the faith and the movement, wherever the Spirit leads us, they go hand in hand. They are part of the same equation. Sometimes the movement is dramatic. You think about those who are hiding Jews or the runaway slaves, those who are sponsoring refugees today in Poughkeepsie, or who are offering sanctuary to those who are unregistered in this country, immigrants in Kingston. Sometimes it's really dramatic. When Abram left his home and went off to new land as an immigrant in a country that really didn't want him, that was pretty dramatic. But sometimes it's not so dramatic. Sometimes it's being led simply to come into the church when you don't know why you came today and it was too cold out, and for some reason you were led here, you're here, and in dramatic or not, it can be life-changing. It's a little bit like Nicodemus. Nicodemus, who came to Jesus at night. Now, I'd like you to just hold this image in your mind for just a moment. A city official, an elected official, because he's part of the Sanhedrin, he's a governing official, and a religious official, because he's a Pharisee. He's a big guy. Sneaking around at night into places he ought not to go. You've probably never heard of that before in the news. But he is sneaking around to this place he doesn't want to be seen. And why would he do that? Because the illicit place he's going is Jesus. Why would he risk his reputation, or maybe even more, to sneak out at night, to pester Jesus with a bunch of questions? And we know that by going at night, which is really not the usual thing to do, he considers this to be a risky move. Why is he doing that? It's not really dramatic, but he is being led by something, driven by something, to somewhere he would not have expected. Now, can you call that faith? He doesn't even understand what Jesus is talking about. So can you call that faith? Of course you can. Because faith has never been about understanding everything. I mean, if you understand the Trinity, for example, come up here and tell me, because I don't get it completely. Most of us don't. Most of us don't understand everything there is to understand about our faith. Faith is trusting enough to be led to somewhere new. Nicodemus trusted whatever was urging him on. Now, he had heard of Jesus before. He may have even heard Jesus speak before. But whatever he knew of him, it compelled him. He needed to know more. It drove him to risk being caught going out at night, to go and pester Jesus with all these questions. And he went away, maybe not quite understanding, but that's not the end of it. Because faith, belief, trust isn't just sort of this one-stop thing. You don't just say, oh, I believe in God, and be done with it and go home. Nicodemus didn't just say, oh, I get it, Jesus, and go home and never think about it again. It was just the starting point of many different times when he'd have to stop and say, "Where to now, God?" And that's how it is with us too. We trust enough to go to the next step. We trust enough to follow to wherever God is leading us, not really sure where that is going. I mean, look at Abraham. My goodness, he traipsed halfway across the Middle East and then still didn't stop. And every now and then when he did stop, he'd say, "Okay, now what?" Faith isn't the end of everything. It's the beginning. It is the place where we stop and look and see where we're going next, where we will be led next. I don't know where your faith is going to lead you. I don't even know where my faith is going to lead me. Sometimes all we can say is, where I'm going next, what I'm doing next, is anybody's guess. Well, God probably knows. Amen.